As we begin this morning, I'd like to share a wisdom lesson from Anthony DeMello in his book, The Way to Love. If it is love that you truly desire, then set out at once on the task of seeing. This requires calling things by their name, no matter how painful the discovery and the consequences. If you achieve this kind of honest awareness of the other and yourself, you are likely to experience terror. Think of the terror that comes to a rich man when he sets out to really see the pitiful condition of the poor, to a power-hungry dictator when he really looks at the plight of the people he oppresses, to a fanatic, a bigot, when he really sees the falsehood of his convictions when they do not fit the facts. That is why the most painful act the human being can perform, the act that he dreads the most, is the act of seeing. It is in that act of seeing that love is born, or rather, more accurately, that act of seeing is love. Springfield, Missouri made a brief appearance on Fox News Flash on January 21st recently with what I think was meant to be a shocking headline, but really it's just common knowledge by now. It read, "Missouri Diversity Session Tells Teachers Colorblindness and All Lives Matter Are Forms of White Supremacy." The article describes activities and handouts from a local professional development session for middle school teachers that had been leaked to the Discovery Institute, an anti-evolution organization. In a testament to being uninformed, Fox News was outraged to uncover educational materials that have been openly discussed and distributed for years. The article claimed that middle school teachers, quote, were pressured to endorse certain ideas about race. But the examples given in the article are not, or at least should not, be controversial at all. For example, though the article acts surprised that the training session began with an acknowledgement that we live on land taken from indigenous peoples, it's no secret that the land that now makes up the United States was taken from indigenous peoples, largely through violence and deceit. It's no secret that children of color are disproportionately treated as adults, unconsciously perpetuating racism and propping up racist systems and cultures. And it's no secret that white people endanger the lives of people of color by using the flimsiest of excuses to call the police on them. We have the hard data on all of this and have had it for years. And after all these years, I can't imagine a valid excuse for still not understanding how saying all lives matter distracts us from dealing with the ongoing tragic and cumulative impacts of white supremacy on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. In all these cases, the Fox News article bristles at the idea that racist ideas and actions could somehow be connected to upholding racist systems and cultures. So again, none of this is new. One version of the handout, I suspect Fox News was shocked to discover, goes back at least 15 years. I did a simple image search using keywords that were from the article. I searched for overt, covert white supremacy, and I found pages of results, many of them variations of a resource developed by the Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence back in 2005 and updated by Ellen Tizzolo in 2016. In other words, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been more than patient with us white folks' slowness to learn and change. And there is no excuse for our enduring and harmful ignorance. And the sessions like the middle school training that the article was decrying, that should just be common. It should be the norm. We've got to learn and practice these things. So, dear fellow white people, if any of the material that Fox News was complaining about that I just listed is news to you, then you're most likely way behind on the learning and changing you need to do. And I invite you to take that as an invitation to do the work. And if you would like to take a simple step to support our local educators so that they can continue to receive the kind of training and resources that Fox News and the Discovery Institute was so mistakenly terrified about, you can send a message of encouragement to the Springfield School Board. As you might expect, the board and also and especially the faculty and staff have been getting lots of pushback and hostility for promoting racial and social justice. So let them know you're glad that Springfield Public Schools are trying to get on the right side of history and on the right side of marginalized students and communities. And I just ask you to send them an email or a letter. As important as all of this is, there's another aspect to this story that connects to larger conversations about how we remember the past, deal with the present, and create a better, more just, more compassionate, and more livable future. The Fox News article made two connections to this larger context that I think we need to make sure we notice. First, one of the participants in the professional development session asked, "Is the district saying that we should be Marxists?" And second, the article connected this training event to the Trump administration's executive order opposing critical race theory and the announcement of a new legal coalition with the aim of bringing a lawsuit about these kinds of issues before the Supreme Court. That Marxist dog whistle is one of the more persistent ways that we see white people trying to prop up the status quo while avoiding accountability to white supremacy. Please note that you don't have to have actually read or understood Marx or Marxism to invoke the reflexive disgust that has become associated with that name in the minds and hearts of many people. Interestingly, the person who blew this particular whistle received a fair bit of space in the Fox News article. And while we don't know if the person who said these things was white or not, it's difficult to avoid concluding that what he said benefits the racist status quo. At any rate, this person expressed three things. He said, critical race theory is racist and he does not like, critical race theory is Marxist and he does not like Marxism. Then he said, critical race theory pushes a narrative and silences anybody who has any kind of disagreement. And lastly, he said that he really, really likes Martin Luther King Jr. This is a quote from the remarks he made at the training. He said, Dr. King did not teach the kind of vitriol that we see out of Marxism. Marxism has a long, replete history of countries being bigoted and prejudiced against others and then murdering millions as a result of it. Claiming devotion to Dr. Martin Luther King while decrying Marxism is more than a little ironic, since Dr. King himself was also accused by the FBI, no less, of being, quote, a wholehearted communist who followed a Marxist-Leninist line. But now that the establishment has had 50 years to forget about how radical Martin Luther King Jr. really was, and 50 years to try to shape his popular image into a harmless icon of racial harmony, he can be evoked in a non-threatening way. Meanwhile, the new generation of folks insisting on and leading us toward racial justice are now, like King was in his own time, accused of Marxism as a way to scare the general populace away from the hard but liberating work of dismantling white supremacy. Unfortunately, the Fox News hero is not unusual or even particularly original. In the new legislative session, our neighbors to the south are one of the states now considering institutionalizing a rejection of critical race theory and, more broadly, an honest understanding of history. Arkansas Representative Mark Lowry has introduced House Bill 1218 in the hopes of prohibiting schools from any lesson, event, or activity that, to quote the bill, promotes social justice on the basis of issues such as race, gender, and social class. It also prohibits any class, event, or activity that, quote, advocates the solidarity of a group of students based on ethnicity, race, religion, gender, and social class. The bill is obviously atrocious and I really hope unlikely to get any traction, let alone pass, but just proposing a bill like this helps normalize what really should be outlandish, ridiculous ideas. As Allie Noland pointed out in the Arkansas Times, This modern-day book-burning law would cut funding for any public schools and universities that did their job of making students think about hard things. However, apparently House Bill 1218 was not enough for Representative Lowry, who has sponsored a second bill that shows yet another way to make sure students are not encouraged to think about the hard things. House Bill 1231 is called an act creating the Saving American History Act of 2021. Its explicit goal is, quote, to prohibit the use of public school funds to teach the 1619 Project curriculum. The bill describes what it calls an activist movement that aims, quote, to deny or obfuscate this history by claiming that the United States of America was not founded on the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, but rather on slavery and oppression. The language in the bill, if you read the way it's proposed, it goes out of its way to deny the fact that wealth and power in the United States did grow out of slavery. And we could add to that out of the conquest and the violence against indigenous peoples. And the bill simply does not understand that the founders and early citizens of the United States could both have lofty aspirations and ideals on the one hand, while also participating in oppression and injustice on the other. Instead, the bill claims that, quote, the 1619 Project is a racially divisive and revisionist account of history that threatens the integrity of the Union by denying the true principles upon which it was founded. And the state of Arkansas has a strong interest in promoting an accurate account of the history of the United States of America in public schools and forming young people into knowledgeable and patriotic citizens. I think it goes without saying, but Representative Lowry and I have very different understandings of what constitutes an accurate account of the history of the United States and what it means to be knowledgeable and patriotic citizens. Nevertheless, these kinds of ideas and these kinds of criticisms of social justice movements are becoming normalized, and similar bills are being considered both in Iowa and Mississippi. This is disappointing and dangerous, but it's also not surprising, especially after the spectacle that Donald Trump made in the waning months of his administration. If you remember, last September, Trump issued an executive order on combating race and sex stereotypes that prohibited, quote, federal employees, contractors, and grant recipients from discussing or considering concepts such as critical race theory and white privilege, and discouraged diversity education and training. In a move you'll recognize, Trump claimed that diversity training promotes Marxist doctrine and is itself racist and sexist. As malicious and misguided as the order was, it still had ripple effects across the nation as organizations, universities, and nonprofits had to weigh the decision to continue programming and multicultural celebrations with the very real risk of losing their funding. Then, in December of 2020, Donald Trump took aim at the New York Times 1619 Project. What did such a project do to incur such wrath? In the project's own words, the goal of the 1619 Project is to reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. Doing so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country. More to the point, the project asks, what if the country's true birth date, the moment that its defining contradictions first came into the world, was in late August of 1619? Though the exact date has been lost to history, that was when a ship arrived at Point Comfort in the British colony of Virginia, bearing a cargo of 20 to 30 enslaved Africans. Their arrival inaugurated a barbaric system of chattel slavery that would last for the next 250 years. This is sometimes referred to as a country's original sin, but it is more than that. It is the country's very origin. However, Trump and his allies insisted that such truth-telling about the United States history was toxic propaganda, and even went so far as to say that, quote, left-wing rioting and mayhem, and we can guess that Trump was talking about things such as the Black Lives Matter movement, are the direct result of decades of left-wing indoctrination in our schools. He insisted that, quote, critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda, ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds that tie us together. It will destroy our country. That's why I recently banned trainings in this prejudiced ideology from the federal government and banned it in the strongest manner possible. The only path to national unity is through our shared identity as humans. And that is why it's so urgent that we finally restore patriotic education to our schools. And that goal of restoring patriotic education to our schools resulted in Trump's establishment of the 1776 Commission last December. The commission then issued a report on Martin Luther King Jr. Day of this year that disrespected both the man and his memory. Like the unnamed man in our Fox News article, the commission sought to pay lip service to Dr. King while hollowing out his message. They wrote and claimed that the civil rights movement was almost immediately turned to programs that ran counter to the lofty ideas of the founders. They criticized affirmative action policies and argued that identity politics are the opposite of King's hope, that his children would live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This report, and please take note that this report was issued on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, right? The Capitol riots were January 6th. They had almost 2 weeks to reconsider how they framed this report. They released this report almost 2 weeks after the Capitol riots, and they asserted, today Americans are deeply divided about the meaning of their country, its history, and how it should be governed. This division is severe enough, and they're talking about people who support critical race theory and things like the 1619 Project. This division is severe enough to call to mind the disagreements between the colonists and King George and those between the Confederate and Union forces in the Civil War. They amount to a dispute over not only the history of the country, but also its present purpose and future direction. If you hadn't noticed that before, please pay attention now. The 1776 Commission report was an official document representing a now well-established conviction that movements for racial and social justice represent a threat somehow to the United States, rather than an opportunity for healing and growth. And they are steadfast enough in these convictions that they publish these words comparing their enmity for American citizens who have been tirelessly working to bring about a more just, equal, and compassionate society for everyone with the disagreements that led to the American Revolution and the American Civil War. And while Trump is no longer in the White House and President Biden quickly rescinded the 1776 Commission, the influential people whose ideas brought the commission into being and the people who were willing to storm the U.S. Capitol to uphold their distorted, whitewashed version of U.S. history and identity, they are all very much still around. These are the natural consequences of us failing to take seriously, as a society, the ongoing work of understanding our history, both the wonderful and the terrible, both the oppression and the resistance to that oppression, both the proud moments and the disgraceful ones. As W.E.B. Du Bois taught us back in 1935, if we had been listening, we shall never have a science of history until we have in our colleges people who regard the truth as more important than the defense of the white race, and who will not deliberately encourage students to gather thesis material in order to support a prejudice or buttress a lie. Discerning what is true and what is prejudice, that is where our work still lies. So, on one side, represented by the 1619 Project, we have an insistence that in order to properly heal from our historical and present-day wounds, we have to be honest about them and even go out of our way to learn about them. And on the other side, represented by the 1776 Commission, we have an insistence that in order to be patriotic, we have to tell a version of our history that minimizes and even hides those wounds. And while I'm not aware that any of the conservatives and conspiracy theorists in my social and familial circles stormed the Capitol, I am aware that many of them are sympathetic, if not supportive, of the 1776 Commission and its ideas. The people in my life that are or have been most insistent that remembering our mistakes is somehow undermining our ability to be a healthy society also happen to subscribe overwhelmingly to Judeo-Christian beliefs. And that just makes the whole thing stranger to me. After all, the Jewish and Christian scriptures both are largely a record of people struggling and often failing to create a healthy society. And they wrote it all down so it could be remembered and so that they could learn to do better. Psalm 106 is one such example of how this memory was included in the spiritual lives of these ancient communities. If you're familiar with it, you'll know that the psalm praised God for steadfast love and blesses people who observe justice, but then it pivots really quickly and it begins reciting a list of all the times the nation had failed to do just that, had failed to do righteousness. Words such as, both we and our ancestors have sinned. The psalmist declared, our ancestors rebelled against the Most High at the Red Sea. And God rescued them, but they soon forgot God's works. They had a wanton craving in the wilderness and put God to test in the desert. The psalmist then described them, their own ancestors, as jealous and wicked, going so far as to worship an idol. Yet even when Moses persuaded God from destroying them, the psalmist says they grumbled in their tents. They couldn't even be happy at being spared, right? Scattered for their arrogance, they still didn't learn, and they attached themselves to another god, eventually going so far as to practice child sacrifice. Yet through all of this, through plague and exile, the psalm ended as it began. Steadfast love brought the people back together with each other and with God. For their sake, God remembered the covenant and showed compassion according to the abundance of God's steadfast love. This is but one example of a biblical model of how to remember a difficult and painful history. And I got to say, it's much more consistent with the 1619 Project than with the 1776 Commission. In fact, I wonder what the reaction would be if we rewrote that psalm and put in all the mistakes that have happened in the United States history instead of in ancient Israel. However, we do have a biblical example of a ruling elite that refused to honestly acknowledge the painful history that preceded them. Unfortunately for lovers of the 1776 Commission, that approach lines up much more closely with those on the receiving end of Jesus' scathing denunciations in Matthew 23, where he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, well, if I had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your ancestors, you snakes, you brood of vipers. How can you escape being sentenced to hell?" Resistance to truth-telling, such as the 1776 Commission and Arkansas House Bills 1218 and 1231, testify against themselves. They whitewash history and whitewash the present. They comfort themselves by saying, first, well, things were not really so bad back then. And second, well, if things were that bad, well, we've progressed. We've gotten better. And so there's no reason to bring it up again. And there are many people who quite blatantly say things today like, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, if we had lived in the days of slavery, if we had lived in the days of Jim Crow, well, that's getting a little too close, isn't it? That if we had lived when people were doing those awful things, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of slaves, of immigrants, of indigenous peoples, and of all the marginalized communities that spoke up for justice and received violence and oppression in return. I'm sharing these examples because people who have been critical of attempts to honestly deal with the history of the United States have often claimed some special patriotic and maybe especially religious virtue. If you're going to make that claim, it won't be through citing the Jewish and Christian scriptures, though, because those records show us a people who did not shy away from naming and repenting of their mistakes and the mistakes of their ancestors. And we should not shy away from honestly dealing with the United States history either. I do understand that many white people still feel bewildered by changes we've been asked to make and that we are thankfully increasingly expected to have already made. And I understand that they are afraid that they will get called out for making mistakes. And if this is you, I can empathize with your discomfort, but please understand, it cannot be offered as an excuse for inaction. Please, let me challenge you to change your perspective. Rather than getting stuck in your fear, get busy doing the work. If you find yourself worried about making mistakes, view that as an invitation to learn and do better. So guess what? You make fewer mistakes. If you worry that you're ignorant about the insights and demands that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are making regarding racial justice, start paying attention to their voices and take their words to heart. If you fear that you will somehow experience the pain of prejudice and discrimination, devote yourselves to working with others to create community where everyone's voice is heard and everyone's need is met. But whatever we, and especially white people, do, we must stop letting our discomfort get in the way of action. We need to turn and honestly face the reality of 1619 so that we can better understand the reality of 2021. Because we all must take steps to do our part to dismantle white supremacy and heal the deep, terrible wounds that racism has left on our communities and on our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.